Hello and good tidings. You may have noticed that this is not my usual content. Today I present to you a podcast. My very, very good friend Jared wanted to consider disability in a project for a PhD class and approached me to collaborate on the art of remaining in place. I hope you enjoy this podcast. It covers a lot of my own history with the disabled community and describes how I came to identify as disabled, and premieres some exclusive demos from the upcoming album I'm working on. Ooh! I'm really excited with how it turned out, and I'm really excited for you to hear it. Before we begin, I would like to let you know that there is a transcript of our conversation in the description, and closed captions are available. Enjoy!
Hello and welcome to The Art of Remaining in Place, a single-episode podcast about movement, music, and disability. I am your host, Jared Aronoff, and I am joined today by a very good friend of mine, Tarquin Alexandra.
Hello and good tidings. My name is Tarquin Alexandra. I'm a musician. I make alternative indie pop, and I've been releasing music since 2018.
Why don't you start us off, Tarquin, by telling us a little bit more about your music? What's it about? Where did it start? Where does it come from?
Well, I have a very foggy brain, and therefore a very hard time processing feelings. At some point as a youth, I realized that songwriting was helpful in taking feelings from foggy nonsense chaos and making them understandable to my brain. I've now released 1 album, 2 EPs, and I'm now working on my 2nd album. How about you, Jared? Why don't you introduce yourself and explain to our dear listeners what I'm doing here?
Well, I suppose I will. I am a first-year PhD student in film and media studies, and I have been friends with Tarquin for a little bit more than 10 years now. I'm currently taking a class on media and migration, kind of looking at the ways that experiences of migrants are mediated, looking at media narratives around migration, and kind of asking how we as scholars can build solidarity with these communities. So I approached you for this final project because I became interested in how the questions of my course intersect with disability. You identify as disabled, don't you? Where does your connection with this community come from?
Well, I have 3 main chronic health conditions that we know about. I'll give you the very short version. I have POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, mast cell or MCAS, which is mast cell activation syndrome, and ME/CFS, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome. This means that my body doesn't regulate blood flow properly, it thinks I'm allergic to everything, and it hurts all the time. Ooh. I am perpetually exhausted, I need to be horizontal for most of the day, and there's a non-zero chance that I could go into anaphylactic shock at the smell of perfume. I'm also autistic, but we've known that my entire life, and the other ones are more recent. So I'm definitely disabled, but I have a question for you. What does any of this have to do with migration?
Ooh, well, I'm so glad you asked. See, if we break migration down, it can kind of broadly be described as just movement. Thomas Nail does this in his book, The Figure of the Migrant, describing the migrant essentially as a political figure of movement, and that, quote, "There is not only one migrant, but many. Just as there are different types of societies, so there are different types of migrants, different degrees of mobility, and different forces of expulsion," end quote. Movement has always had political ramifications for the disabled community. In the US in the early 1900s, there were these ugly laws that banned, quote, "any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed," end quote, from participation in public space under penalty of a fine that would translate to be about $20 in today's currency.
And that's directed at a community that has been historically denied economic stability.
Yes. And then if we jump forward a few decades, there is no longer the same like blatant punishment for disabled people who dare to, exist in a public space. But restrictions still continue. A good deal of disability activism in the 90s and 2000s was in direct response to casual public restrictions of disabled movement. The kind of attitude that goes, look, disability just wasn't a concern when this building was built, as Tanya Titchkosky puts it. These kind of like shrug of the shoulders statements that come from assuming that disabled people would never interact with my public space, so why would I consider including them in the design?
And in the present day, we're having this conversation in the middle of a global pandemic where movement and interaction with public space actually puts disabled and immune-compromised people at risk, and we have to further restrict our movement for our own safety.
And over the past 2 years, I have watched the music that you have been producing grow and evolve in some really interesting ways as you have kind of come into your own identity within the disabled community. I've also noticed that throughout this pandemic, disabled people have been at the center of the crisis and one of the most impacted populations. Roughly 6 in 10 COVID deaths are in people with a disability, but disabled voices have so rarely been centered. So, as someone whose voice is central to her work, I thought it would be really generative to sit down and talk with you about the disability justice movement and how it came to influence your media.
Well, thank you for taking the time to platform me like this. I think what's especially relevant here is how the pandemic impacted my disability. Like, if I find it difficult to physically get out of bed, that becomes harder when I have fewer reasons to get out of bed. If I'm really sensitive to fragrances, that's going to get worse if my body isn't exposed to them for 2 straight years. I can trace back some of my symptoms to as early as 12 years old, but since COVID started, I've found myself in a constant state of being itchy and dizzy.
Wait. If you're going to list off your symptoms, I can think of a better way for us to do this.
Oh, good idea.
I'm itchy and dizzy and almost always hungry, but I'm nauseous and cautious of standing up too quickly, for my vision is fleeting and so is my stability,
both mentally and physically.
Hot flashes, cold flashes, can't see without glasses, night sweating, day sweating, throat tingling, tongue itching, blood pressure changing, and sleep hallucinating, and I'm almost always on the verge of fainting. Also, eye twitching and itching, it feels like someone's standing on my torso, and more so, my bones feel like they're breaking, and my head, my chest, my muscles, lungs, and joints are always aching, and menstrual pains debilitating, sharp pain and dull pain and throbbing in my brain. It feels like there's cold liquid bubbling in my veins. It hurts like there's bruising when nothing is there. I've seen so many doctors, they sit in their chairs, say it's psychosomatic. I guess I'm just being dramatic.
I love the humor of this song. I love how it's both kind of grim, but also really tongue-in-cheek at the same time.
Why, thank you. I have always been interested in the dynamic of an upbeat song with sad subject matter. I think this kind of levity allows me to examine difficult topics in a way that can be both accessible but also not shy away from the ideas that I want to explore. I also think that as I reflect more and more on this style, it feels like an outcome of autistic masking, taking what might be an uncomfortable idea and trying to make it palatable for someone else.
As somebody who is also autistic, who also has a long history of masking, I fully relate to that. I wanted to pick up, though, on that last line about the doctors, because there's a kind of anger in there that is being masked by the humor of the song, and I kind of want to get into what's behind that anger.
Oh, there's absolutely an anger there. This song may have been an unsuccessful attempt at breaking into TikTok, but it fully comes from a place of frustration.
So what's at the center of that frustration?
Well, it's pretty widely accepted that doctors are these kind of god-like creatures that know all. I certainly grew up believing that, at least. So when my health got bad and confusing, I went to doctors for help, and not only did they not know what was wrong with me, but they were also incredibly dismissive and minimized my experiences. A double betrayal. So I'm definitely pretty angry about that.
That's a bit of a common experience amongst younger women trying to access healthcare, isn't it? I feel like I've heard that sentiment from a number of my female friends.
It's a common experience for many marginalized groups, not just women. Again, I've had some of these symptoms since before we met, but it wasn't until things got really bad that my symptoms were even acknowledged as a problem.
Do you remember the moment when that changed? Like, when did your doctors start to take this seriously?
Well, my doctors still don't fully take me seriously, but I had just discovered that I really love doing musical theater. I had worked as an assistant stage manager and performed in a few community projects, but it got to the point where doing one evening's worth of work would take me a week to recover from, but I had to work every evening and then often throughout the day as well.
What was it like to lose that thing that you had just discovered that you cared about? You know, to have to place restrictions on your movement for the first time?
Well, I didn't actually feel the weight of it for a while because you're kind of taught the narrative of illness is that you get better. So I was in denial for a while. It wasn't until the pandemic hit and I came to identify as a disabled person that I actually started grieving it.
And what made you finally come into that identity and accept it about yourself, even if your doctors wouldn't?
Well, it wasn't really a single occasion, but more of the accumulation of many smaller moments of realizing and accepting it. Frustrating things that are ordinary for me, like having to stop what I'm doing and lie on the floor because the exhaustion of a simple task is too much. These things build up so gradually and are dismissed so easily by everyone around you, including doctors, that you don't really get a single realization moment of this is happening and it's a thing. So you keep pushing your body through these things, and every so often you have a moment of this isn't normal, this shouldn't be happening. And you eventually get more familiar with recognizing these things instead of pushing through them, but with that you start to realize that doing things like making food for yourself is an activity that's too much for you, and then it becomes easier to identify with the label disabled. And then, well, COVID happened, and between my 3 conditions, some are autoimmune disorders and others are characterized in connection with autoimmune disorders, so the pandemic for me represents a much more serious threat than it does for able-bodied people. My doctors still won't confirm if I'm high risk or not, and there are definitely other disabled people who are more at risk than I am, but I found my fears and feelings reflected back at me in the online disabled community, and it began to feel more and more appropriate to understand myself through that lens. Meanwhile, I began to feel less and less connected to able-bodied people. I was watching the ways that COVID restrictions kept lifting before those spaces were fully safe for me, and watching how enthusiastically people were going back out into the world, and I found that really dehumanizing.
Yeah, based on some of the conversations we've had together, I've gotten the impression that this pandemic has been a bit of a radicalizing experience for you.
Yeah, it absolutely was a radicalizing experience. I've spent the past 2 years watching public health measures that protect my safety, my well-being, and my existence within public space become the latest topic of debate in contemporary politics. There are people who think that my right to safety is an extreme position, which I feel gives me permission to take on even more extreme positions, so I'll say it. I think that perfume should be illegal. You laugh, but it should be.
This sounds like a big shift. How did this change your identity?
Well, there was definitely a big shift in my mental health towards the beginning of the pandemic. A positive shift, which I know you wouldn't think so. But it was the first time that my disabled body had full permission to exist in the way that it needed in order to function at its best. Of course, there is a balance to be found, and resting all the time isn't necessarily more helpful than overdoing it all the time, but I needed a lot of rest. It has taken the whole of the pandemic thus far for me to be able to find that balance and develop habits that support that balance and support my changing and fluctuating needs. Most disabled people do not have the privilege to stay inside long enough to figure that out, and I never could have done that had I continued to push my body to operate and exist within an able-bodied society. And also, like many people, the pandemic was an opportunity to explore other facets of my identity, and I also found that categories like queer and aromantic described my lived experience more than I thought they did before. Being able to understand and accept my identity as a queer disabled woman and consequently understand my relationship to the outside world, even if that relationship is adversarial, has allowed me space to exist in a way that's actually been really beneficial to my mental health, which completely contradicts my doctor's assumptions that all my symptoms are psychosomatic, but they never really listen when I tell them that.
And how did this change your music?
Well, being in a better headspace opened up a lot of room in my brain to process emotions and experiences that I wouldn't have previously.
You described at the start how your music is a way for you to cope with uncomfortable feelings. Have there been any thematic shifts in your music that came with a disabled identity?
Well, I would say themes of disability were always there, I just didn't always know it.
Take me to a doctor. There's something wrong. 'Cause I can feel my heart pounding through my top.
For example, this song that I wrote in 2018, before I fully identified as disabled, it was always about my frustration with doctors, even before I was seeking out diagnoses. I was experiencing physical symptoms that I didn't understand, and that impacted the way that I experienced life, and that definitely came out of my writing.
So really, what's it matter if I rot away in bed? Love me not.
And what about now? How would you say that your music might be different now that you identify more with the disabled community?
Well, once I started consciously recognizing the way that disability informs how I experience the world, I had a lot more songwriting material to work with. I'm currently working on an album called Contortionist, or The Contortionist. I'm undecided on the title. A lot of the songs on this album I wrote since coming to terms with this identity, and the album kind of tells a story about how I came to understand myself in this way. I've prepared a demo of one of these songs for you, if you'd like to hear it.
I absolutely would like to hear it.
Oh, the bark on the California trees, the temptation to peel it, to feel it underneath my skin. I would walk from the city to the sea, just to be the fool to do it, to prove it that I still can win. If isolation is a place, then I've reached the destination. So really what I need is to propel the situation. It's a wound, but we're fighting for the bleed, just to be the exception to the rule, to be the unscathed knees. Could I be the illusionist I need to be, just to get where I desire on my own 2 feet? I've seen the fickle fates and the ceaseless celebration of the shattering of souls for the sake of decimation. And the fools go on insisting, hey, that's just entertainment. But my craving still remains, and I know what I'm creating. But how much should you sacrifice to reach your destination? To do what you insist is right, to make your declaration. If everything is volatile at some point, then what's wasted? My time is only mine to lose if I'm too sick to claim.
So there is a very noticeable difference between your previous work and this. This song leans much more explicitly into that grim kind of undertone that you were masking in your other music, and it puts it right on display.
Yes, able-bodied people have jaded me. I have no further patience for making myself palatable for them.
How would you say that you've found yourself jaded by able-bodied people?
Mainly through COVID. There's a lot of ways that this pandemic has revealed systemic injustices and brought out into the open how people in power do shitty things. But I've also had to spend the last 2 years watching the outside world become more and more enthusiastic about framing my body as expendable.
Ah, like the truckers and the anti-maskers?
More than that, I mean how, like, US public health officials are calling Omicron deaths in people with 4 or more comorbidities really encouraging. Or how even my own friends and family will go out to bars or restaurants or concerts and things because it's safe for them. Which is like, A, you're putting me at risk if you're going to do that and then see me. B, you're putting other immune-compromised people at risk who don't have the privilege to stay at home all the time like I do. People who might have to share space with you at the grocery store or in the subway or at their place of work. And C, you're making this whole thing last longer for all of us and making the time I and many other immune-compromised people have to stay trapped inside even longer.
So what you're saying is that it's not the truckers or the anti-maskers that are radicalizing you. It's the kind of pandemic liberalism of people who will, they'll get their vaccines, they'll follow all the public health guidelines as far as it means that they can protect themselves, but who will also forget to include you in that return to normal, or refuse to make space for you in the return to normal, or assume that you will just be able to isolate for an undetermined amount of extra time as a way to kind of hand wave away the responsibility for creating infrastructure that keeps people like you safe. Essentially removing any possibility of you having a safe social and public life.
Well, it's the truckers and the anti-maskers too. But yes! And what hurts the most is that people who are doing this are my friends and my family and the people who are supposed to be in my corner and have my back. It's like everyone else is jumping to return to normal, as if normal ever worked to begin with, and I'm left behind like, hello, I'm still here. It was isolating 2 years ago when we all had to do this, but it's even more isolating now when it feels like I'm being left behind. A whole population of disabled, chronically ill, immunocompromised people are getting left behind. Does anybody care?
I think it's less that...
And like, so often I'm hearing that the conversation about pandemic isolation being bad for people's mental health. What about my mental health? Sorry, you can talk now.
Well, I was going to say that I think it's not so much that able-bodied people don't care, as much as it is that leaving you behind is kind of the whole point. Like, the reason why the rest of us are able to start going to restaurants and things now is not despite the fact that you can't, but specifically because you can't.
It's the knowledge that people like me won't be there that allows able-bodied people to go. The premise behind this return to normal is built around restricting my movement in public space.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, the line that I keep hearing right now is, we need to learn to live with the virus, which is just...
Oh, every time I hear that, it sounds more and more like something that has been heavily focus grouped to manufacture consent for lifting public safety measures to restart the economy. It's so weird to me.
But I think there needs to be more critical consideration of who is included in that we, because it is an exclusionary we.
It is. To reference disability scholar Aimi Hamrai, terms like we or like everyone in these contexts, quote, give the impression that legible belonging in a population is unmediated by historical, political, or social ways of knowing, unquote. Essentially, what does we mean in the context of a world that has historically devalued particular bodies?
I think it's worth noting, though, that I'm not being excluded from the return to normal because able-bodied people hate me or actively want me dead. It's because disability just isn't at the center of the conversation and people aren't thinking about it. They think that because they have their vaccines and such that they're probably safe. That's just where the messaging is right now. Of course, if disabled voices were included as part of these conversations, we would know that this is wrong. Able-bodied people are just as much at risk for developing long COVID as I am, and we're in a position where we actually know that post-viral infection for COVID is a thing. Post-polio syndrome wasn't identified or studied until over 3 decades after the polio vaccine was available. Many disabled activists have been working to remind people that COVID is a mass disabling event through post-viral infection, but they really aren't being heard. I don't think that able-bodied people are entirely at fault when so much of the messaging from health and government officials stresses that COVID is not something to worry about anymore.
Well, I also saw a study published by Allison Skinner-Dorkenoo and a bunch of other people that was done on white people in the States. And the study found that when white survey respondents were made aware of the racial disparities of COVID-19 infection and death, this led to a reduced fear of COVID, reduced empathy for those vulnerable to COVID, reduced support for COVID safety measures, and that all these things were actually further reduced when the racial disparities were framed as a product of pre-existing systemic inequalities in the healthcare system. The study suggests that when COVID is associated with a particular marginalized group, such as people of color, it psychologically distances white people from the virus, making it more abstract and making it feel less concerning. And I think that this applies to able-bodied people as well, especially considering how disabled populations are being positioned as those most at risk. So yes, part of this is because disabled voices and perspectives are not being included in the conversation. But I think that part of it could also literally just be ableist brainworms.
But I also think that ableist or not, this isn't entirely a problem of personal responsibility. These are systemic problems that we need radical solutions for.
In Johanna Hedva's essay, Sick Woman Theory, Hedva pushes back against Hannah Arendt's definition of the political as an action performed in public because this definition excludes a lot of disabled activism. Quote, "How do you throw a brick through the window of a bank if you can't get out of bed?" Unquote.
I love that quote.
I do too.
I think a big part of the answer is going to be online activism. Online spaces have been so key for disabled communities in the past, and they're going to continue to be going forwards.
Absolutely. I think another part of the answer to that question, though, is to just, ask your very, very good friend Jared to go and throw that brick for you. Part of the answer to this is going to be able-bodied solidarity.
Well, if the ableds want solidarity with me, they can stop asking me if I've tried yoga. But I'm going to turn this around on you because I've felt solidarity from you this whole time. How do you approach building solidarity?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because I don't exactly feel like I'm entirely one of the ableds myself. I may not be as vulnerable to the coronavirus as you are, but I am also autistic. I have a membership card to the disabled community, and for me, that gives me a vested interest in this issue. There are advocates for eugenics towards people like me right now, in the present moment. If your existence can become something to debate and your movement can become expendable now, then that sets a precedent. And that means that my body or bodies like mine could become expendable in the future. Your expendability is my expendability. Your exclusion from the return to normal is my exclusion from the return to normal.
But your solidarity doesn't come only because you're also a part of this community. You're not the only one at risk if society learns from this that throwing a vulnerable community under the bus is a great way to restart the economy. How long until we have to learn to live with climate change is the rhetoric used to sustain the Western economy at the expense of climate refugees.
I do think about that a lot, and I wonder how much we will look back on this moment in a decade or so and see it kind of as a rehearsal for something bigger.
What do you mean by something bigger, though? Does that not imply that the violence of this moment is not big enough? That kind of sounds like if you don't care enough to protect disabled people now, maybe you'll care about hypothetical refugees in the future? Are those not the same people who don't care?
Well, from what I've seen, I kind of get the sense that disability as a category of identity often gets forgotten about in progressive spaces.
Yeah, especially these past years as the needs of the disabled community have come up against people's basic needs.
I often see this articulated in able-bodied spaces as an issue of personal comfort in a way that borrows a lot from progressive consent narratives. A lot of asking if I am personally comfortable taking on risk by doing an activity, as if I am the only one being placed at risk from my participation. Your movement is the one that's being outwardly politicized right now, but we're kind of living in a moment when all movement is inherently political. Where we go, who we see, how we position our bodies in physical space, these are choices that we make. and there are power relations attached to those choices. You are absolutely right that this is a systemic problem and that a narrative of personal responsibility is not the answer. But also, from my perspective, there is a good deal of room for solidarity in actively withholding my own return to normal until the outside world is safe for you. That is a tangible, material, and admittedly small thing that I can do that makes the world just a little bit safer for you.
I think that makes the world safer for a lot of people, not just me. I also think that's not a solution that's accessible to everybody. The problem with finding systemic solutions to systemic problems is that the solution to problems for one group creates new problems for a different group, and I don't know if either of us are qualified to propose solutions here. That said, I also agree with you that simple things we took for granted before, like going to a restaurant, are not politically neutral activities anymore, and we can't fool ourselves into thinking that they are for the sake of able-bodied comfort. I think that the power structures of society are ultimately responsible for the underlying issue here, but I think that able-bodied people need to confront the small ways that they are complicit in this and sit in the discomfort that comes with that.
And I think that the best way of opening up to that is to spend more time just listening to disabled voices. And I think that was kind of my goal here. You know, I wanted to make your perspective a part of the conversation and give a platform to the ideas and connections that I don't really feel like I've heard outside of disability Twitter and talking to you.
Thank you, friend. I also just want to say that I don't speak for all disabled or chronically ill or immune-compromised people with what I've said today. It's a diverse community, and opinions and needs vary just as much as they do with any other.
Except maybe on the yoga thing.
Yes, I assure you that all of your disabled friends have heard of yoga. You don't need to bring it to their attention.
Before we go, I also wanted to make a note on how we recorded this podcast.
Yes, because my brain is too foggy to record a spontaneous conversation. We scripted this ahead of time and recorded it over a couple of days with a lot of stopping and starting and directing each other.
I edited it to try and make it sound as authentic as possible, but it was heavily planned in advance by talking through what Tarquin wanted to say with this project and working collaboratively to organize those thoughts into what would sound like a conversation.
Some of my ideas wound up translated into your voice, and some of your ideas got translated into mine.
It is very much a product of our collective hive mind. I'd also like to send a special thanks to Ellie Berry, another PhD student who actually has a background in disability studies. She consulted on this project and helped me find a lot of the sources that I had been referencing throughout.
I appreciate Ellie.
I think we all appreciate Ellie.
They can probably hear the end music by now.
Yeah, what song is this?
This is the song that I would like us to end on. It's another unreleased demo called Ballerina. I think it captures the kind of frustration that we've been talking about, and it's a bit more fun than the last one we heard.
Well, I suppose we shall listen to that as we sign off then.
I suppose we shall. I wish you all good tidings.
Best wishes.
And many happy returns of the season.
Like distant sirens, the heart of the issue is imminent but never does arrive at the hands of fate. A spinning ballerina is waiting for her batteries to die. It's the music box complex, catastrophic state of mind, lulling underneath the satisfaction of divine. The funeral where no one makes a speech outside of the comfort of their seats. The endless cycle, droning in the background of every situation that she sees to seal the fate. The fuel in the fire is every single syllable they breathe. It's the music box complex, catastrophic state of mind, lulling underneath the satisfaction of divine. The funeral where no one makes a speech outside of the comfort of their their seats at the Perpetual Theater, put on a show. She takes her bow, but they never do go. Eyes on a carcass of what was a girl, turned to an ornament, served to the world. Round and round and round she goes, round and round and round she goes, round and round and round she goes. It's the music box complex, catastrophic state of mind, lulling underneath the satisfaction of divine. The funeral, where no one makes a speech outside of the comfort of their seats. Round and round and round we go, round and round and round we go, round and round and round we go, round and round and round we go.
Hello again. If you enjoyed that and you would like to see and or hear more from me or Jared, you're in luck. I have left a link in the description to a page where you can find my music on your music listening platform of choice, as well as how you can find me on social media if you're encountering me for the first time. Jared's Twitter is also linked in the description, and if you think Jared is a good podcast host, then let me introduce you to Banquet at the Flum Dumpster, a podcast hosted by Jared and our other friend Eric. They take themselves way less seriously and watch bad movies so that you don't have to. I think it's great. I genuinely listen to it, not just because it's my friend's podcast. Also, I wrote the theme music, so go get yourself some more Tarquin Alexandra content. Thank you for listening. I wish you all of the good tidings. Farewell.